Please, Jane, go ahead with your kick-off presentation.
All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
So as mentioned, my name is Jane Ombiro. I'm the head of data protection services at AgTech Limited, and I'm also a researcher for the Association of Privacy Professionals in Africa. So we conduct extensive research on privacy and data protection developments across Africa, and we analyze the impact of those developments. All right, so I was to cover data governance, issues to do with informed consent and what that means in the agri-tech perspective, and also the developments in privacy and data protection across Africa and how that will have an impact in these practices. So data governance ideally is the establishment and management of authorities, accountabilities, processes, practices for managing data. So data governance speaks to the people, the policies, and the processes that are developed to be able to now implement data management practices across organizations. So again, without data governance, you as an organization or as an institution, you might not be able to really comply with the relevant data protection laws that sort of regulate the operations that you are involved in as an institution. So if you look at Nigeria recently, there's a bank called Fidelity Bank in Nigeria that was fined around 350,000 US dollars because of poor data governance practices. So with that, they were processing personal data of data subjects without informed consent. So that's after the regulator conducted the investigations and they found out that this bank was actually not complying with the relevant with the Nigerian Data Protection Act. So they were fined the monies, and the key violation was the lack of obtaining informed consent from the customers whose data they were processing. So that's the importance of data governance. With data governance, once you identify the policies, the processes, the standards that you will use to implement data management and by and large comply with the relevant data protection laws. Again, the goal for data governance, definitely it facilitates better decision making, because with data governance, issues to do with data quality also becomes very integral. So with the data is of quality, then it informs better decisions across the organization. Again, also it protects the needs of businesses and data stakeholders. It also promotes the adoption of common approach to handling data. So we've seen instances where organizations we've worked with do not have a data governance framework. So you'll find that different departments handle the same data set differently, which again becomes problematic when it comes to compliance with the applicable data protection laws. Because if you find the finance department is handling the data subject data differently from how the human resource department is handling that data, the issues of compliance become very challenging because of that lack of uniformity, because there's no umbrella framework that determines at the organizational level, there's no umbrella framework that determines how these data sets are going to be handled in a common way. Again, data governance reduces cost, it increases productivity and effectiveness through coordination of efforts. Right, so now we move to consent. So again, this webinar is largely based on issues to do with consent and specifically the farmer's consent. So ideally, for consent to be valid, it has to be freely given. So freely given basically means that the farmer must have control and genuine choice. There should be no issues of duress, force to get consent. So it has to come from them. They need to be willing to give that consent. And also the idea of choice. It has to be really their choice. And choice should be very expressed that without your choice, then we will be unable to sort of collect and process your personal data. Again, the consent has to be specific to a particular processing operation, meaning if you're collecting consent to do if you're collecting consent for research, then ideally you can only use that data for research purposes. You cannot repurpose the data and use it for something else. So the consent has to be specific. So whatever you want to do with the data, you have to bring it to the attention of the farmer that I will only use your data for this purpose, so that when they're consenting, they know really what purpose the data is going to be subjected to. Again, consent has to be unambiguous, meaning the farmer, it has to be clear. They have to make a clear statement or an affirmative action that leaves no room for doubt as to their intention to give consent. And ideally, it has to be an action. So they have to, if it's virtual, then they have to tick a box that they're actually consenting. So it should never at any point be implied. And then it has to be informed. Of course, farmers, they must be given all the information about that particular processing activity in a language that they understand and comprehend. So informed consent ideally means that all the information that they need to know, including the full details of who is collecting their data, where is this data going to be stored, what are some of the security controls that have been implemented to safeguard that data. All that information has to be brought to the attention of the farmer at the point of collecting their data. So then I'm moving my slides, don't seem to be moving. All right. So again, conditions for informed consent. So ideally, the person who's on the ground, who's collecting this data from the data subject, before they get the data, they need to first and foremost inform the data subject about the identity of the controller or the processor. Of course, the controller is the organization that determines the means and the purposes of processing, and the processor is an entity that has been engaged to process data on behalf of the controller. So the identity specifically means what is the name of this organization, where are they located, what is their contact information. So all that information has to be brought to the attention of the data subject at the point of collecting the data. Again, they must be informed the reasons for collecting that data. So what processing operations is the data going to be subjected to? Again, what data are you collecting from these farmers? Are you taking their name, their location details, the number of cows they have, the farm, their farm location? So again, the types of data you're collecting from the farmer, you have to spell it out before they give you the consent. They need to know what data will you be getting from me. Again, if you're going to share the data with third parties, who are those third parties and what are their contact information? So, because I know right now there's a lot of data movement in and out of Kenya and in and out of organizations resident in Kenya. So again, the third parties you're sharing this data with, you must inform the data subjects. Again, you must, if the data is going to be transferred outside Kenya or outside the country of collection, it has to be brought to the attention of the data subjects. If it's the EU, you have to tell them this data, we are going to transfer it to Germany, and these are some of the security controls that we have implemented to safeguard this data in transit and at rest. Again, you have to inform the data subject that they have certain rights under the applicable data protection legislation. So if it's the right to access, you tell them if you want to access this data at any time, you have the right to do so. You have the right to be forgotten, meaning you can request us to delete all the data relating to you that we have in our organization, and we will do that unless, of course, there are reasons that would prevent us from deleting the data. Again, the right to withhold and withdraw consent, so that those rights have to be clearly spelled out to the data subject. And then of importance is that you must also ensure that the person you're collecting the data from is of age and of sound mind, because only a person who's above, like I'll use Kenya as a case study because I practice in Kenya. So in Kenya, persons below the age of 18 do not have capacity to enter into contracts and to give consents, yeah? So that's why you also need to establish, is this farmer above the age of 18? If yes, then they can consent to give their data. And also issues to do with soundness of mind. Do they have any mental illness that impairs their judgment and their decision-making capabilities? So those are some of the issues, again, that you need to consider. And this has become very problematic because we have worked with organizations, and if you look at some of the policies they have, some of the internal policies they have, and there's an implication because it's the NGOs, so they do a lot of work, charity work. They interact with a number of beneficiaries, but if you look at their documentation, there's an implication that they obtain consents from children, which is very much illegal in Kenya, and you know, it could be subject to administrative fines. All right, so again,
Jane, please note that you only have like 1 or 2 minutes left. So I suggest you select the key points of the next slides. Thank you.
All right, so again, remember the burden of proof, it's definitely on the person getting consent to prove that they obtained valid consent from the farmers. So it only takes the farmer going to the commissioner to say that they did not give consent, and then the burden will definitely shift to the person collecting consent. And then issues to do with data ownership. Remember, at all material times, the data relating to a farmer belongs to the farmer. They own the data, unless and until the person, the organization that collected the data, anonymize the data in such a way that it cannot be used to identify the farmer who gave that data. So when the company does the anonymization, so at that point, the applicable data protection laws no longer apply to anonymized data, so they own the data. But if the data can still be used to identify the farmer, then they do not lose ownership and control over that data. So I'll be moving a bit fast now, because so good practices when it comes to good practices and challenges of informed consent. So it's advisable to always obtain written or recorded consent as opposed to oral or verbal consent, because we've seen so many data subjects going reporting to the commissioner. So it's when you have written or recorded, it's evidentiary. You can prove to the commissioner that they gave their consent. So again, challenges, of course, issues to do with the language barrier. You'll find that most of these farmers are in areas where they do not really speak the common dialect. So again, language barrier. And then most of the farmers do not really take a keen interest on their personal data. And then also keeping up with emerging legislations and other developments in privacy law has proven to be a challenge, especially in the African context where so many countries are now implementing privacy and data protection laws. And then we also have the commissioner making pronouncements on this privacy and data protection issues. So keeping up with them and ensuring compliance with those developments has proven to be an issue. And another issue is definitely the lack of uniformity in legal requirements, because you'll find that in the EU, GDPR requires something specific, and in the Kenya Data Protection Act, we are speaking to something different. So the lack of uniformity in privacy and data protection law is also a challenge, so because it makes compliance a bit difficult. And then developments in regulation and compliance. So we're increasingly seeing so many African countries enacting data protection laws. So Ethiopia recently enacted their Data Protection Act. And then again, the Malabo Convention, which is the African Union Convention on Privacy and Cybersecurity Laws, came into force a while back. And then another developing issue is the adequacy dialogue between Kenya and the EU. So if Kenya is granted the adequacy status by the European Union, it will make it easier for organizations to sort of transfer data from the EU to Kenya without employing additional security measures to do that. And then, of course, we have the data protection regulators in Africa, the NADPA. They have this body where they work closely with each other to ensure that to sort of support each other, because again, data protection legislations are rather new in Africa. So if you're seeing that the data protection commissioners across Africa are working closely together, I think that's a welcome move, and it might bring some sort of uniformity in terms of application of privacy and data protection laws. And lastly, of course, African countries are now sort of borrowing from the EU when it comes to imposing hefty fines for non-compliance with privacy and data protection law. Like I did mention the Nigeria Fidelity Bank case, where Fidelity Bank was fined $558,000 because they did not obtain informed consent from the customers. And also Meta, the Facebook parent company, was fined $220 million for, among other issues, failing to comply with the Nigeria data protection legislation. So that marks the end of my presentation. I'm sorry it was a bit rushed. If you have any questions, just put them on the chat and I will respond as we progress. Thank you, Roger. I think I'm done.
Thanks so much, Jane. Yeah, I see that there's already some questions in the chat. So people have been asking, how to get consent from people under 18. So I think it would be interesting if you try to answer some of these questions. How to deal with young people under the age of 18 using farming apps? And is there a way to get consent from people under the age of 18, maybe from a guardian or parent?
All right, so can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. So when you want to obtain consent for people under the age of 18, of course, they cannot give consent because they lack capacity to give consent. So what you do is you obtain the consent from their parent or their legal guardian. But if you obtain it directly from them, then that becomes a violation of the data protection law, and you might risk being fined for that. And for persons under the age of 18 using farming apps, you need to implement age verification mechanisms, yeah? because we see so many applications, you put the day, the year you were born. So again, that automatically determines the age. So if you do not meet the age of 18, you're sort of blocked from even creating an account on that particular application. So for applications, definitely you have to implement age verification mechanisms, and then for the other ones, you have to just obtain consent from the parent or legal guardian.